This morning, President Trump's approval rating is at 36% in the latest Gallup poll. The number comes as multiple reports say the president is laying the groundwork to undermine the Justice Department's special counsel, tasked to investigate any links between the Russian government and the Trump campaign and, quote, any matters that arose or may arise directly from the investigation, and any crimes committed in response to the investigation. According to the Washington Post, President Trump has told aides that he was especially disturbed after learning that special counsel Bob Mueller would be able to access several years of his tax returns. But his lawyers are sending a message with Jay Sekulow saying, quote, the scope is going to have to stay within Mueller's mandate. If there's drifting, we're going to object. Sekulow cited a report in Bloomberg based on a single source that says Mueller is examining financial transactions between Trump, his associates, and Russia going back to at least 2004. The Washington Post reports that Trump has asked his advisors about his power to pardon aides, family members, and even himself in connection with the probe, according to one source. Another said Trump's lawyers have been discussing the president's pardoning powers amongst themselves. An advisor says the president has simply expressed curiosity in understanding you could Google that, Mr. President, of his pardoning authority and the limits of Mueller's investigation. Quote, this is not in the context of, quote, I can't await to pardon myself, a close advisor said.
And the New York Times, as well, is digging deeper into its reporting that President Trump's lawyers and aides are seeking ways to discredit or even fire special counsel Bob Mueller and his prosecutors. The effort includes scrutinizing donations to Democratic candidates, investigators' past clients, and Mueller's relationship with James Comey, who's firing his FBI director as part of the special counsel's investigation. The president had considered Mueller to replace Comey as FBI director and even met with Mueller shortly before he was appointed special counsel. In Trump's interview with the New York Times on Wednesday, he said, quote, talk about conflicts. Mueller was interviewing for the job. There were many other conflicts that I haven't said, but I will at some point. Not clear what that is. White House advisors told the Washington Post that another potential conflict is an allegation that Mueller and Trump National Golf Club in Northern Virginia had a dispute over membership fees when Mueller resigned as a member in 2011. A spokesperson for Mueller said there, in fact, was no dispute. According to the Times, Justice Department rules are that prosecutors may not participate in investigations if they have a personal or political relationship with the subject of the case. However, something like a campaign donation is not included on the list of things that would create a political relationship. And the Deputy Attorney General's order appointing Mueller special counsel allows for a broad mandate out of the Russia probe into, quote, any matters that arose or may arise directly from the investigation, end quote. On Wednesday, the Deputy Attorney General was asked to address some of these issues.
Some of the attorneys that he has hired, that several of them have made donations to Hillary Clinton, to the Clinton campaign. Does that bother you? Does it make you believe that those people have any reason to be questioned in terms of their impartiality in this investigation?
You know, the Department of Justice, we judge by results. And so my view about that is we'll see if they do the right thing.
As we said before, we have the power-hitting third baseman of the Philadelphia Phillies, Mike Schmidt, here with us, one of the authors of one of these incredible blockbuster pieces. Mike, I want to ask you, there's a lot in this piece, but obviously the flashing red light here is the notion that the president's talking about to what extent he has the power to pardon his aides, his family members, and potentially himself. So tell us a little bit more about what your reporting shows about what his attitude is towards that question. Like, how he's asking the question with what kind of disposition?
Well, I think the president clearly understands the seriousness of Mueller, and he clearly gets the problem here, which is that an investigation which starts with Russia is just going to go in a lot of different directions. And what the White House is trying to do is try and find ways to stop Mueller from going into the area, going beyond that. And what can they do? So they're researching the lawyers that Mueller has hired. They're looking at their backgrounds. They're looking at the cases that they dealt with. They're looking at whether they ever got, rebuked by courts or anything. Just trying to, come up with any type of information that they could use to either disqualify some of these lawyers going forward or to put them on the defensive and to create problems for Mueller. They are certainly taking an aggressive posture here. This is not the most unusual thing, look, when Ken Starr was appointed, there was, folks in the Clinton world that immediately started demonizing him for political reasons. I mean, this seems to feel along those lines and be, if not more severe, because I think the president wants to be very aggressive here. But it's certainly a stance that they are going to fight this instead of saying, look, well, we'll do everything to cooperate and we'll just kind of leave you alone to do what you're doing. I think, the president's really going to go after them. The president's lawyers, I think certainly some of them don't want him to do this, but as we saw in our interview this week, he can't but help himself but continue to attack Mueller and the process.
Yeah, Michael, that leads to the question of the president's lawyers that you just referenced. According to your reporting, what impact, if any, are any of the lawyers that he has surrounded himself with having on the president in this regard?
Well, it's our sense that they don't want him to be out there, at least, some of them don't want him to be out there being so aggressive on this issue. They think that it antagonizes Mueller, it raises questions about, the independence of Mueller, and it's just it's a distraction and it's not helpful. But at the same time, this is a president that believes he's his best spokesman and has shown the willingness to attack these folks. He even attacked his own attorney general just the other day. And he sees that as his best offense here. But the problem is that at the same time, it sort of raises questions about the process. He's really undermining Mueller in ways, certainly in the public's eyes, and sort of putting a political lens on it that may not really be there.
All right, well, speaking of...
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.